Hello.
Hello there.
What's your name?
I'm Matthew Clark.
Hi, Matthew. And where did you grow up and where do you live now?
I was born in Epsom on the outskirts of London, and then we moved to Brighton when I was 10 in 1966. And so I grew up really around Brighton. Yeah.
And where do you live now?
And I still live there actually. I was away for years in different places, but I came back 25 years ago and bought a flat in Hove, and that's where I live now.
And what's been your practice for the predominant part of your life?
Well, I got interested in yoga and meditation and all those sorts of things when I was a teenager, and then just started at about the age of 16, started experimenting, as all my friends did. We were all experimenting with trying to sit in lotus posture and meditate and things like that. And some of my friends went off and became devotees of various gurus, all that sort of stuff. This is like early 1970s. And so I started experimenting, but I never did a proper or a regular yoga practice or anything like that. But then I met Danny Paradise. I met him in India. I think it was 82 or 83. Anyway, and he was teaching yoga then. And then we met, we became friends, and then in 1990 I started doing Ashtanga with him.
Right.
And that went on, over one summer. I was living in a cottage in Sussex at the time, and he was there, and so there were a couple of other friends also doing Ashtanga yoga there, so I Ashtanga yoga, and I started then, and I never stopped. Still do it every day. An amazing thing. Yeah.
So were you doing another form of yoga before that? Or?
No, just I used to meditate a bit sometimes, and do a bit of stretching, a headstand or a lotus posture or something, but nothing regular. But then all sorts of things happened in my life, and then it came to a certain point, and when I started with Danny doing the Ashtanga, as soon as I started, I thought, this is it. I want to do this. I want to do this, and I decided actually then to make yoga the main thing that I do every day, and everything else got to somehow fit around that, because it seemed to me that unless I was feeling good about everything, it was no point to concentrate on anything else. So best to start concentrating on the yoga.
And so how did that open your life up when you just started to focus on the yoga?
I realised it was an immensely beneficial thing to do for health, well-being, mental stability, all sorts of things. And also very, very interesting. I mean, you can go as deep as you want into this thing. And I'd always I'd read a lot about it already, and I just became very enthusiastic for it. I thought it was a fantastic thing to do.
Did you personally have experiences of the changing nature of yoga in you then?
Oh yeah, I mean, in that I went into when I started, I was in it was psychologically. There's all sorts of things that happened which weren't very good in my life. I mean, terrible actually. I mean, nothing horrendous, but it wasn't good. And I found that just starting a regular yoga practice, this routine thing, it was just, it's extraordinary how it can regulate neural chemistry. You start, because really our moods and our activities are so much governed by what's going on up there, our neural chemistry, if you like. And if there's an imbalance, it makes everything we do very difficult and a lot of obstacles. But then if you can somehow work on your neural chemistry, then everything starts working easily. And
is this something you found out at the time, or that was just happening naturally, and then you discovered afterwards as you deepened your awareness of what the practice and how it helped?
Well, I noticed as soon as I started doing it regularly, that was almost from day one, that I started noticing changes. And that my more disturbed mental state from before had just immediately gone down a grade. I thought, this is amazing. This stuff actually works. And it's a combination of breathing and stretching and concentrating and all this stuff. And it has enormous potential.
And so you found like you hit something. And what did you do then once you discovered Danny, once you kind of like realised that Ashtanga yoga was the way? How did then your life get directed?
Oh, well, I don't know, I just went on doing, I carried on the yoga practice, and then that was 1990, I started properly, and then in 98, after a gap of 17 years, I went back to university. And I've been a lot in India in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot in India, and always been fascinated with India. And then I went back to university and started doing all this stuff academically. And so I did a master's thesis on the Naths, the Nath yogis, and did a PhD on the sannyasis. It's another branch of yogis, if you like, and started researching all that stuff.
So how did the academic study inform your personal practice, and the personal practice inform the academia and all stuff like that? Really interested to see how, when you start to really look at it at that deep level, like in an academic way, how it then changes your approach to your own practice and things like that.
I think, well, first of all, by researching it, you find out about all sorts of practices. Everything from mantras or breathing or, the physiology of the body or whatever, you start finding out more about it by doing some research. And it just, it sort of dovetails into my own practice in that, you find, and also there's the historical side of things, realizing people have been experimenting with these things for a very, very long time. And there's a continuity there. The people are still doing all this stuff. And you can see what happens to yourself if you start doing all this stuff, and then you can read about other people who've done all this. And I think it's very important to understand the history and the philosophy of all this, because the way you think about things also informs your daily life and practice and everything else.
So when you researched it, when you were doing your own study and you were doing your own PhD and things like that, was there anything that you discovered that changed the relationship of how you understood it?
Not really, but I suppose a key insight right from the beginning was that in traditional practice in India, the focus and the aim is a non-ordinary state of consciousness, samadhi. Or there's many names for these things, nirvana, whatever, in the Buddhist world. And this condition, the samadhi condition, sometimes called moksha, or there are lots of words for this thing, that is the central point of doing it. Acquiring powers, that's another aspect of it, which comes automatically when you start experimenting with non-ordinary states of consciousness. And I suppose one of the insights was the significant difference between the focus in traditional practice and in the modern world, modern yoga, where the emphasis is much more on health, well-being, relaxation, and all those kinds of things, brilliant as they are, but if you like, the cherry and the cake is sort of left off because it's very radical. It's very, very radical. And if you look at the life of yogis in India, traditional yoga, it's a very, very radical path compared with what we do here, because we go to a yoga class, we have a nice time, then we go home and have pizza and watch telly and everything's sort of back to normal. Whereas in India, for many of these yogis, it's a full-time occupation and it's a very different kind of goal. Even though it does all the other things as well, but there's this as you say, the ultimate goal is this non-ordinary state of consciousness. And that, I think, is a very important thing. And I think awareness of that is also starting to become, people are becoming more aware of that side of things as time goes on. Yeah.
Did this then inform you about what your practice was doing? Did it then change? Did it, with your own practice when you studied this, did it make you go, oh well, what am I going to do in my practice? Or is it more like you were just really interested in studying what the other people, or what was traditionally being taught?
Well, I think that by understanding the traditional side of things, then I can understand also that in my own experience, that where I'm actually going with all this, what I'm trying to do with it all, the ultimately, and so you might not pursue techniques or practices that are very radical unless you actually want to attain some non-ordinary state of consciousness. So knowing that was the goal of it, and that's what people are up to, it sort of adds an extra dimension to the thing. There's a lot more. Yeah.
Do you think then that? Do you get a sense now, because you learned that's kind of like what you're directing yourself to in your own practice, or is it just you enjoy doing the practice for its own end?
Well, I enjoy doing the practice for its own end, anyway. But I am aware that there is an enormous power in even having a glimpse of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And my own interpretation of all that, it's a bit like if you have a proper deep experience, yogic experience, however it's attained through breathing or whatever. There's lots of different practices, but if you do ever sort of break through into a kind of trance state, it has enormous potential benefits. It's a bit like rebooting the computer or something like that, defragging the hard drive, or sometimes I say it's like putting the brain back to factory settings, because it gets all clogged up, But if you have a non-ordinary state of experience, a non-ordinary state of consciousness, which can be, people get that from even extreme sports and that sort of thing, where you just break through into this other dimension through extreme effort or extreme exertion or concentration or breathing, and it has that condition has a very enormous therapeutic benefits. Yeah.
Have you experienced this? And
to a degree, I mean, obviously there's degrees for all these things. Yeah.
But from an academic perspective, when you experience these states yourself, does it then even help you to inform your own academic research?
Well, yeah, I think they go together. I mean, I'm unusual in that I do both things. I mean, in fact, when I say unusual, I mean, there are now actually is a whole generation of academics who are yoga practitioners who are also doing research into it. But I think if you don't do practices yourself, it's very difficult to appreciate some of the subtleties that are communicated in the tradition about these sorts of things. And if you studied academically, if you've never experimented on yourself with yogic practice, then I think you're missing something. Yeah.
Since you've been starting like the academic research, has it changed a lot over the years? Like what you've been researching, how the more information has been coming out, and has it directed yoga culture, if you like?
Well, in the last 10 years particularly, there's been a lot of interest in academia in yoga, and at SOAS where I am, they had for 5 years as the Hatha Yoga project, and there was a lot.
And you were involved in that?
Only partly, not properly. I was just on some board, overseeing whatever it was. I'm not even overseeing, but James Mallinson, he kindly put me on this thing, But I wasn't actually involved in the project. But the project came to SOAS, and because he was there, and then people working on texts, working on practices, and so on, and researching the history and philosophy and so on. And that has and it's not just at SOAS, but also in other places. And this research has deepened understanding of the history and background of yoga. And it's illustrated that it's a much more complex history than we might have understood 15 or 20 years ago. Influences from other cultures, the historical development of certain things. It's not as though yoga practices just started boom like that, unchanged. It's been a constant process of evolution for the last couple of thousand years in terms of what people do and how they describe various things. So I think it's the research that's been done has been very valuable to illustrate that, particularly to emphasize the continuous evolution of understanding. And it's not just a fixed thing, that yoga started with Patanjali and then it sort of comes to the modern era and that's it. It's like, no, it's much more complex than that. So, yeah.
And what have you found as your favourite part of the research of yoga?
Oh goodness, there's this thing, the Journal of Yoga Studies, and so it's the only peer-reviewed journal out there on yoga studies, and it was started by Elizabeth Michaelis about I think it was 2017 we started, 2018, 17, 16, and so we produce editions of that. We've done 4. We've got another one coming soon. But these I find it very interesting reading new research, and I'm very lucky because I get to read it all, and we can publish it all as well. People send stuff in, and so there's always stuff to find out, new material. The new edition that we're about to publish is going to have an article on yoga practices in China in the 1970s. Women practicing yoga and publishing on yoga in the early 20th century in Bengal. So there's lots of diversity, and so it's very interesting to find out about all that stuff.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you sound like it's just exciting to be involved.
Oh,
in
it is. I'm very, very lucky like that. Because involved in just having a job in stuff that I find very, very interesting. Yeah, it's fantastic.
And is there anything else you've like discovered? I know that you're working in the field of psychedelics and yoga and stuff, and like, what have you kind of drawn from that study?
Well, my own belief is that actually psychedelics and yoga are two sides of the same coin, because uniquely psychedelics can induce the kinds of states that you can attain through yogic practice. And that's why I think they're two sides of the same coin in that way. And also psychedelics, if taken with the right intention, in the right situation, appropriately, and all the rest of it, and not for entertainment exactly, but if you take those things appropriately, those substances appropriately, they can give access to those same kinds of states. And my own belief actually is that, and I've written about this, but I believe that probably exposure in ancient India to regular exposure to psychedelic experiences led people to develop yogic practices without the use of psychoactive plants, particularly breathing, which is the key. I think the breathing that's where it starts. You sit and you breathe, and it's the breathing. Your breathing changes in exact relationship to your thinking. When you're tired, you breathe in a certain way. If you're excited or angry, you breathe in a certain way, and so when you sleep, you breathe in a certain way. So by watching and then regulating and then controlling your breathing, then you can induce changes to your mind. And that practice, the people engaged very deeply in these practices. It's speculative, but I think exposure to psychedelic states led people to develop those kinds of practices in ancient India.
And so you've been, I've seen, getting really involved in that. That seems to be like quite a principal, like, centre of your work now.
Well, yes, I got into psychedelic studies only really by accident. About it was really about 2000, about 8 years ago, when well, it really started about 20 years ago, I suppose. Yeah, more like 20 years ago, when when I was looking at when I was doing my PhD, and before that, there's this stuff called Soma in the Vedas and Homa in the Zoroastrian tradition, and there were a lot of theories about what this stuff might have been, and I started looking at the topic in great detail, never intending to publish on it or anything like that, but at that time I was regularly drinking ayahuasca. And I thought, oh my goodness, this stuff is probably like ayahuasca, something like that. And then I started doing more and more research. And in fact, I published 2 books on that, one big one and one short one, and a few articles. And I realized that almost certainly what they were up to in the ancient world was making concoctions that had the same effect as ayahuasca, and which can induce these trance-like states. And I thought, well, I got into research. I looked at the plants they were used, looking at texts and finding out about it, and I came to the conclusion, yes, that in ancient Greece, in ancient Persia, and in ancient India, they were making ayahuasca analogues, and that's what they were doing. And it still goes on in little pockets of Asia. The Soma rituals, and as I say, I think that was probably the key. Again, it's speculative. People could say, well, what's the evidence? There isn't. It's just a speculation. But yeah, regular exposure in a culture to psychedelic states, and then people developing breathing practices, particularly to induce those kinds of states without the use of plants. And then, of course, other practices too, they help regulate neural chemistry in the same way. Not just breathing, but then meditation, particularly stretching and all these kinds of things, and concentration. And so the whole package can be kind of a very powerful
And
effect.
I suppose recently, with more psychedelic studies and psychedelic experiences being more in the modern culture than ever, it's a really amazing research to have.
Well, I think it's very interesting what's going on at the moment, and my interest just currently is the relationship between psychedelic states and yogic states. And in fact, I'm starting to write a little thing on that at the moment, and you see these yogic states described in the text and what happens. And one of the things that happens is like no breathing and that sort of thing. But then there's a lot of research going on in other areas entirely, in psychedelic research, where they're also looking at what happens to the brain under under the influence of psychedelics, people having brain scans and all these sorts of things, and then realizing that these states are actually the same thing. But what we're inducing is obviously it's the same kind of state, but produced through different means.
It's amazing research. So if we were to finish it up, what do you think you have learned through all your study and all your practice about yoga that you'd like to share with others?
Well, I think that even doing a minimal amount of yoga, even if it's just a few minutes here and there, it's very beneficial. And I think just everybody can benefit from doing those kinds of things. Even if you just sit and meditate for a few minutes, knowing how to do that is such a great tool to have. And when you learn more, you learn how to keep fitter and more flexible, and you learn about breathing and all these kinds of things. It's enormous potential benefits to society and the individual, enormous. And you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to get equipment, you just get up and you can, anywhere. I mean, I've done yoga in waiting rooms in railway stations, just anywhere. You can do this stuff anywhere, And if you have these tools, if you have this as these practices under your belt, maybe you don't even do them sometimes, but if you know how to sit and meditate, if you know how to do some basic asana practice and all these kinds of things, pranayama, you know how to do these things, you've got this most amazing toolkit at your disposal for your journey through life. And so I think it's a very, very, very useful, about the most useful thing we can investigate, I think, as a species. Yeah. And hopefully by feeling better about ourselves, we feel better about other people, and then we all get on much better.
Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate your time.
Great.
Cheers.
Okay.